leadership, finding our roar, looking at Samuel. That was prompted by a verse that Tina brought out with the children. And for those of us who believe we have the right to become the sons of God, that right, the word right, means actually like a royal proclamation, like a governmental decree. We're royalty, sons of God, sons of the King of Kings, sons of daughters. And royalty trains their children up with an attitude, an air of authority. There's leadership in our position. There's a roar. Proverbs 28 says, the bold, the righteous, as us, righteous are as bold as lions. We need to have that same authority, that air, that attitude, that belief in who we are. It's an identity thing. So we looked at Samuel, and we found that Samuel exhibited three things. He had an attitude, not access. He had apparent access because they placed him in the temple at a young age, but that had nothing to do with what gave him. It was his attitude over his access. His desire to be, he says he slept as close to the Ark of the Covenant as he could get. He was willing to listen. And the fact that he had been placed there as a young child, sacrificing his family, his mother, his father, his brothers, his sisters, because of his parents dedicating him to the Lord. There was an attitude involved in him wanting to get all that he could get. That gave him his roar. And then finally there was a servant's heart and surrender, which are really two different things, even though they sound the same. A servant says, I'll do whatever I need to do. Surrender means, Lord, I'll do it however you want me to do it. And we found those two things. Today we're going to look at Moses. And I'm going to preach from Exodus 3. So if you get your Bibles and you want to follow along, you can turn there. But I want you also to look at the end of the story. So Exodus 14, just kind of put your finger there. We'll flip back and forth. The beginning of where God calls Moses is in Exodus 3. When they finally come out of the promised land, not come out of the bondage in Egypt, on their journey to the promised land. Exodus 14. So I want to start a little bit with some context here first, so we understand where it is that Moses is standing. And God called Abraham. I'm going to start way back, 5 generations before they even got to Egypt. Right? Abraham was called, and God told him, follow me to a land that I will show you. It wasn't Egypt. It wasn't Egypt. And I'm going to make you the father of nations. And he has, after many trials and tests, he has one son, Isaac. Isaac goes on his way and has 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob tricked his father into the birthright. Actually, Esau gave up his birthright. Anyway, Jacob became the son of promise. And Jacob has his name changed to Israel, which means striver with God. And just so that we get this clear, God likes people who come to him with an argument. Right? Because you're coming to him. He knows that if you have the fortitude to come to him with the argument, that you will see his way. He's not worried about the argument. He wants you to come to him. He calls Jacob Israel, striver with God. Israel has 12 sons, the favorite of which was Joseph. Right? Joseph gets sold by his brothers who despise the fact that he's the favorite. And they sell him to the Ishmaelites, who, by the way, were the descendants of Abraham's son Ishmael that he had by the handmaiden Hagar, because he wasn't willing to wait for God to work it his way. He wasn't entirely surrendered at that point. I'll do what you want, but I will do it the way that you want. Surrender. So Joseph gets sold into the Ishmaelite traders. They take him to Egypt and they sell him as a slave. God's actually preparing the way, because there's a great famine in the land to come. And so Joseph gets down into Egypt and he rises to a position of prominence. And he's able to provide for all his brothers and for his father and for the whole family. But Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, his 12 sons, and some of them had children by the time they get to Egypt. We're talking 5 generations. Okay? We were just thinking about this the other night. In my family, my children are the 5th generation from the 2 brothers that came over from Italy. Right? And we tell stories about them. But it's getting lesser and lesser. The stories on what they know about their great-great-great-grandfather. By the time they got to Egypt, it had been 5 generations. They got to Egypt because God prepared a way for them to provide for them during the famine. But after the famine, they were a little comfortable down there. They didn't want to go to the land that God had showed them. They stayed in Egypt. And so as time went on, they became slaves. And as time went on, a lot of time went on. 400 years, it says they were there. 400 years between going to Egypt and Moses being born. 4 centuries. And I just need to paint a picture of what we're talking about. Johann Sebastian Bach. Anybody know who he was? A lot of people know who he was. He was born in 1648, not quite 400 years away. Anybody can tell me what his favorite color was? What he liked to do for recreation? Where he went to church? Did he go to church? What do we know? 400 years had passed. How about Isaac Newton? Born in 1660. About 400 years. Right? 1619 would be 400 years away. In 1619, we weren't the 13 colonies yet. Virginia was like one of the first colonies. They were struggling for survival. They almost failed to populate Virginia, the Virginia colony, because they didn't have enough support from England. One of the tobacco growers there, John Rolfe, married the daughter of a prominent Indian chief in that area, Pocahontas. Oh, everybody heard that name, right? What do we know about Pocahontas? Anybody know that she became baptized believer? No. We don't know that stuff. 400 years and it's gone. These people came to Egypt. They had no traditions. They had no feasts. They had none of that stuff. Came all after. All they had was their lineage. They knew which son they were from. They could trace their lineage. 400 years later, they didn't know their God. They knew some stories about him, but where had he been for 400 years? Where had he been? Do you think God left? Or do you think that God was just kind of silent because they were comfortable in Egypt and they didn't want to move? And so then consequences kind of took their toll. But 400 years later, they knew about him. They knew the God of our fathers, but he hasn't really done anything since 400 years. That's what Moses was born into, that environment. They knew that there was a God. They didn't really see much of him. They didn't really know him. And it was a long, long time back. So Moses is born. There's an edict in the land because there are so many Hebrews. The Egyptians are a little worried that they might have a coup, make a takeover, whatever. They say all the Egyptian males that are born, they're sentenced them to death. Right? Kill them. Funny how that stays with us through the ages, killing children, or even children before they're born. Right? Where does that come from? Moses' mother, she takes him and she puts him in a basket. And she doesn't send him down the Nile. She puts him in the reeds. Right? He's not going anywhere. She's hiding him. And his sister goes and watches to see what's going to happen. And along comes the Pharaoh's daughter. Who would have thought that would happen? And finds the basket and picks the baby out and says, "Have mercy on him," recognizing that he was one of the Hebrew male children that had been born. She has mercy on him. The sister comes running forward and says, "Hey, I can get one of the Hebrew women to nurse him for you." And she takes that deal up, but Moses is removed from his family. He's taken to the Pharaoh's daughter's house. And although he gets to know his mother long enough to be weaned, funny, isn't it, that Samuel also was taken out of his family as soon as he was weaned. Right? Moses is taken out. But Moses is given a different kind of access. He's raised in a house of privilege. This is the house of the Pharaoh's daughter, house of the Pharaoh. He's raised with all kinds of access and power and authority. He's one of those royals we were talking about, that they train their children up with that air of authority. They're expected to lead something. So he had that. He didn't have much of a knowledge of his God. So attitude was kind of missing. Nevertheless, he gets to the place where he realizes his leadership and he's aware of his people, and he runs into this conflict with trying to protect some of his people, and he kills one of the Egyptians, and then the next day he tries to break up an argument between two of the Hebrews, and they say, "You're going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian?" And he realizes his sin is known. He has no real authority with the Egyptians because they're going to side on the other side of the law for him, and he has no following with his people. He runs. He leaves. He goes from being way up here with status and authority to way down here you find him as a shepherd of sheep. Like leaving a corporate job and ending up working as a greeter in Walmart. Not that I have anything against greeters in Walmart. In fact, I commend and encourage anybody who's got a job at all these days. But the status changed. He was giving up on everything. So that's where we pick up in Exodus 3. God chases him down. He's out in the desert. A shepherd of sheep, a leader of sheep. Exodus 3 verse 1. Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. He led the flock to the west side of the wilderness, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. God introduces himself to Moses with fire. Samuel, who just called out in the night. Moses, he needs a little more. Moses, he needs a little more. He introduces himself with fire. You know what? I like to study, before I put a sermon together, I like to go through all the commentaries. I like to do word searches. I take an interlinear Bible and I'll figure out the meanings of different words and stuff. But when I was looking at this, and one of the things that really bothers me sometimes is there's a whole division of theology. People that have seemed to dedicate their lives to proving how a miracle could happen. Try to make sense of a miracle. You know, the whole point of a miracle is it doesn't make sense. It's not something we can conceive of. It's God doing something that is beyond us. And yet there are all these theologians that say, oh, when they piled up the waters of the Jordan, there was a shift in the tectonic plates, and we had it, you know, or the feeding of the 5,000. Well, the real miracle there was that everybody had a secret lunch of fish and bread and coats. And when Jesus started his example by pulling out his few fish, everybody pulled out there, and there was plenty left over. You know, they got an explanation for it. They have to have an why do you have to have an explanation? It's like you're stealing the miracle. So I'm reading along and hear about the burning bush, and there's this thing in the commentary. It says, you know that there's a plant that exudes a sap that's highly volatile. So volatile that the heat of the summer sun will ignite it. But it's quickly consumed. But then in the small print at the bottom, it says this plant is only found in the deserts of South America. Why are you telling us this? What is the point? But God shows up as fire. And the real miracle is not that it ignited. The miracle is that the bush was not consumed. You know, God's presence is often indicated by fire. And stuff is not consumed. On the day of Pentecost, there were tongues of fire on everybody's head. And their heads were not consumed. And the fire stayed fire until God was done. His presence is often indicated by fire. On the road to Emmaus, two of the apostles were walking along, and Jesus is walking with them. They don't recognize him. They sit down to have a meal. Jesus breaks the bread and he blesses it and disappears from their presence. This is a spiritual sense. They look at each other and say, whoa, didn't we realize that? Didn't we know? Weren't our hearts burning within us? You know, when God shows up, when his presence is there, our passion is alive. Our passion is on fire. And it doesn't go out. We burn for the Lord, but we're not burned up. We burn, but we're not burned up. The proof of this presence in our life is that we can be on fire, and we can stay on fire, and no matter what hell is unleashing all around us, God's presence is there, not burned up. So God met Moses in that fire. He experienced God's presence. And then in verse 4 it says, the Lord saw that Moses had turned aside to look. God called to him from the midst of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Now we're talking like Samuel. Now Moses has got the idea. He takes off his shoes because it's holy ground. You know, when God speaks to us, and He does speak to us in so many ways, it's always personal. It's always just for us. What He says can have implications for everybody, but when He speaks to us, it's just for us. And Moses had a choice. Keep in mind, he was running. He didn't want anything to do with his people, the Egyptians, with any kind of leadership. He wasn't looking for his roar. He had a choice. You know, I was traveling once by airline, and I stopped, I think it was Chicago O'Hare Airport. I had to go to the bathroom between flights. I ran to the restroom. And restrooms at airports always kind of make me nervous. So many people coming and going. You got your luggage to your hand carry, keep track of. I went in the restroom there, and it was empty. Great. I went in one of the stalls, and I'm just getting settled, and somebody else comes in. Hadn't been even 60 seconds. They come to, and there's 20 stalls. But they go right to the one next to me. Right? And all of a sudden, I hear a voice from the other side saying, "Hey, what are you doing tonight?" I'm terrified. I was like, "Are you kidding me?" And then I'll hear the voice continue, because it's on a cell phone. And he says, "My flight got in early. Can I meet you at Balance? We'll have a couple drinks." I was taking what he said personally. I was choosing to listen, and then I chose not to listen. When God speaks, we have a choice to listen, to hear, or not to hear. And Moses heard. You know, also when God speaks to us, it's not just personal, it's purposeful. Everything God has to say to us has a purpose. He doesn't talk just to talk. He talks because He wants to tell us what we need to know to get through something. He talks to us because He wants to give us direction for what He wants us to accomplish. He talks to us for any reason, any number of reasons, but they all have some purpose. Now, He talks to us today. He talks to us in visions and dreams. He talks to us with encouraging words. He talks to us through prophecies. He talks to us through His Scripture. What are we doing with those? There's a purpose for everyone. When He reveals something to Himself, He is revealing Himself to us for a purpose. A lot of us have books full of these words and prophecies and dreams that we've had interpreted. What are we doing with them? Are we reviewing them on a regular basis to see if we're following the directions He has given us? Because at some point He might come along and say, "You're a little too comfortable over here. What I really had in mind for you is out there." And we can go 400 years not seeing His purpose. And what He has to say will get less and less and less. You want to roar? We need to start focusing on what God is telling us. What purpose is He driving us to? That's part of the beginning of our authority. So God tells Moses what He's about to do. Now He's heard the cries of His people. He's coming to free them. He's going to use Moses to do it. We're going to go and see Pharaoh. You're going to lead your people. And the sign is going to be that when you come out, you're going to worship me here at this mountain. We're going to gather around and worship. Let me read it. Verse 11. Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt?" And He said, "Certainly I will be with you. I will be with you." In other words, He's telling Moses, "I have chosen you. We're going to do this together. I chose you. And this shall be the sign that it is I who have sent you, that when you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God, you shall worship me at this mountain. Moses has two questions here. He gets God's purpose in his life, and he comes back with questions. Remember, God loves it when we come to strive with him, because we're coming to him. All right, so Moses raises up two questions. Who am I? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? Who am I that I should lead the people? Who am I? Good question. We can't step into our destiny until we have a good grasp of our identity. Destiny always follows identity. And look at Moses' case. His identity isn't who the world told him he was. His world rejected him. Right? We're not who the world tells us we are. That's not our identity. We're not even who we think we are, because that's shaped by so many things. We're only who God says we are. And how will we know what that is? Unless we're focusing on what he says and his purpose to us. But until we know what God says we are, hey, God says, you're my child. You have the right to be my child. You have the royal proclamation that you are my child. I've said it. Do you believe it? Hello? Hello? Are you listening? Do you choose to listen, and do you choose to follow my purpose for your life? Identity always precedes destiny. Destiny always follows identity. Second question he asked God is, who are you? Moses said to God, behold, I'm going to the sons of Israel, and I'm going to say to them, God of our fathers has sent me. Now they may say to me, what's his name? For 400 years, they didn't really even know his name. They didn't know his name. They knew they had a God, but we're enslaved here. Our God doesn't seem to care about us. Nobody was looking. Nobody was searching for that. So Moses is asking the question, who are you? Who are you to us? Might as well have said, where have you been? But God tells Moses, this is my memorial name. I am. Not I was 400 years ago. Not I will be. I am. God says, I am right now. Present tense. I am the God who meets whatever needs you have right now. I am the God who comforts you. I'm the God who contends for you. I'm the God who provides for you. I'm the God who heals you right now. I'm the God who makes a way for you. I'm the God who saves you. I'm the God who loves you. I am that I am. The sad part of this exchange isn't the questions. Those are commendable. Good questions that Moses asked. But the attitude for asking them is not right. Moses reveals with these questions that he's got a problem. Who am I to go before Pharaoh, and who am I to go before the people? It indicates a fear there, a fear that Pharaoh's not going to hear me, and the people aren't going to follow me. And Moses is revealing that he doesn't really like or trust people anymore. He's kind of given up on that. He's tending sheep. I can kick my sheep around. I can tell my sheep where to go. The sheep follow me. But not people. This is not rare. We could spend a little time in Elijah's house here, but we run into people all the time today. Saved people, people who have committed their lives to the Lord, but many hurtful things from the past shape how we think in the present and project negative stuff into the future. You notice he's complaining about what people are going to say. It's in the future. You don't control the future. It's what people are going to say in the future. You don't control what people can say or do. And you don't control the future. You don't control any part of that. Why is he even worried about that? Rather than just doing what God is telling him to. You know what I'm saying? There's an issue here that goes deeper than his identity. There's an issue here of fear that's based on hurts that we don't surrender, that we don't let go of. And this is where Moses is. Now Moses, in truth, Moses is going to run into some resistance with Pharaoh and with the people. When he goes to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's going to give him a hard time. In fact, the rest of the story goes that there's 10 terrible plagues that bring Pharaoh to his knees, that make him relent. I mean, he turns the Nile into blood, he brings frogs, there's locusts, there's cattle dying, there's 10 horrendous things, including the last one was the death of the firstborn in every house of Egypt. Finally, Pharaoh says, I'm done. Get out. Go. Right? Pharaoh has been broken. But the people, actually, when Moses went back and said, your God is hearing your cries, he's going to lead you out, he's going to make you free, it says they fell down and worshiped. Ooh, didn't expect that. They worshiped. Now, they did get a little concerned when all those things happened that Pharaoh might take vengeance on them. There was some concern, but they never once told Moses, hey, let's not do this. In fact, when it got to the end, and God told them, I want you to go and take articles of jewelry and silver and gold and precious things from the Egyptians. Tell them we're going out to worship your God. You want to look your best, you know. Borrow, basically plunder, all that stuff. I mean, it was a happy dance all the way to the Red Sea. They were excited until they got to the Red Sea. You get to the Red Sea and it's like, oh, how are we getting around that? What's the plan here? And on top of that, Pharaoh changes his mind. Pharaoh changes his mind and sends the army after them. You know what? When they got to the Red Sea, I'm going to read this right out of the scripture. Let's flip over to chapter 14, verse 11 and 12. Pharaoh's army is bearing down on them, and it says in verse 11, Then they said to Moses, Is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the word we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Well, where is that coming from? In fact, this is the very point I want to make. Why would Pharaoh, after being beaten down with 10 horrendous plagues, all of a sudden say, oh, I changed my mind. Send the army after them. What insanity would do that? Here's the hint. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. Against principalities, forces of darkness. Who is behind that sending the army? Who's behind that? And then the people start whining and complaining. Well, we never wanted to come this way. I imagine they're probably taking all that plunder and putting it in the other guy's backs. Right? Who's behind that? We wrestle not against flesh and blood. Who's behind that? Now, here's the lesson in this. If we're going to find our roar, if we're going to stand in what God has us to do, there's going to be some opposition. And it's not going to be flesh and blood, although it's going to look like flesh and blood. Satan's going to throw everything he's got at us, because when we're about to do something that will reveal the glory of God, he's coming after you with everything he's got. You can expect this. Yeah. So Moses was under attack from all sides, but not by the people, not by Pharaoh, not by Pharaoh's army. Satan was coming to stop this. Right? So when God's glory is about to be revealed, here comes Satan. But God knew that Moses had this problem. He knew that he was going to face these obstacles. So he asked Moses a question. He says to Moses, we're back in chapter 3, actually chapter 4 here. What is that in your hand? Moses had a staff, a stick. What is that in your hand? You know, I'm just going to paraphrase the rest of this story, but he took that stick and God told him, throw it on the ground. And so he threw it down and it became a serpent and he ran. Not because he didn't have faith, because he was smart. And that guy says, reach out and pick up that serpent by the tail, and he picked it back up and it became a stick again. For every obstacle, for every challenge, for every problem that we are about to face, because we're expected to be as bold as lions, God has given you a stick. We got a stick. When you walk in the air of authority, you can walk quietly, but carry a big stick. That's not in the Bible, is it? A stick. And you know, Moses had to throw it on the ground. He had to release that stick to see what it could be in God's hands. Right? Now your stick might be your intellect. It might be your understanding or your discernment. It might be your will and perseverance. It might be some ability or some talent you have, but you have a stick. And until it's surrendered, then you can see what God will do with it, and then you have to pick it up again and use it in faith. You've got a stick. So there was Moses, right? Pharaoh's bearing down on him. The Israelites are whining and saying, "We didn't want it." God tells them in verse 14, here's what you do, Moses. Chapter 14, verse 16. He tells Moses, lift up your stick and point it at what you're going through. And stretch out your hand. You know, when we lift up our stick, it might seem like it's too little, like it's not enough. But when you stretch it, it's always enough, because we serve a God that is always enough. He is always sufficient to our every need. He's always enough. He's always sufficient. He never lacks. We serve a God who changes things. He brings dancing instead of mourning. He brings beauty instead of ashes. He makes dry bones into armies. He makes deaf people hear. Yes, he does. He makes blind people see. He makes a cross into an empty grave. Let's stand together. Close in prayer. As we stand, I want you to turn to the person on your left, your left. Tell him, I've got a stick. Turn to the person on your right and say, I'm going to stretch out my hand.
Stretch out your hand.
And now we're going to find our roar, which is not against flesh and blood, but it's an authority over the spiritual forces of darkness. Father, thank you this morning for your message through the life of Moses. Thank you for the obstacles that you are going to send our way to prove your presence in our life and to prove the authority that we have in your kingdom. Father, thank you for the identity that you have given each one of us. Father, thank you, thank you, thank you.